Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 16th of December 2021 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today have been presented on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. In continuing with the weekly series of mains assignment questions from the DNS videos, the question for this particular week here is discuss the role of the parliamentary standing committees in providing accountability in the democratic setup of India. What reforms are required to strengthen them? The answer to this particular question has to be written in 250 words. Now, before writing the answer to this particular question, I suggest you to go through the DNS dated 28th of April 2021, in which we have discussed all the aspects related to the parliamentary standing committees. The first article in today's analysis appears on page number 1 of the text and context page of the Hindu newspaper. The article is titled as The Push for the Zero Budget Natural Farming. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3, Indian Economy, more specifically under the subsection of the Indian Agriculture. Before discussing this particular article in much greater detail, let me first give you the background. See, the Green Revolution has undoubtedly brought success for the Indian agriculture. From being a net importer, India has become a net exporter of food grains. The Green Revolution has also made it possible for us to achieve the food security. However, the Green Revolution has led to a number of second generational problems. For example, the Green Revolution has emphasized on more of inputs. Inputs such as high yielding variety of seeds, fertilizers, credit and so on. This in turn has led to increase in the input cost of the Indian agriculture. Apart from that, the Green Revolution has also led to environmentally unsustainable practices such as the overconsumption of water, decline in the soil fertility and so on. So, to a certain extent, the present agrarian crisis faced in the Green Revolution states can be attributed to these second generational problems. So, going forward, we need to find out the agricultural practices which are more farmer friendly, environment friendly, and more resilient to climate change. And one of the best option before us is the zero budget natural farming. Accordingly, the government has taken a number of initiatives in order to boost the zero budget natural farming. The government believes that the adoption of zero budget natural farming can help us reduce the input cost, it can help us promote environmentally sustainable practices, and help us double the income levels of the farmers. But a number of agricultural experts have cautioned the government with respect to large scale adoption of the zero budget natural farming. The experts have pointed out that the zero budget natural farming, if adopted on a large scale, this could lead to decline in the yield rates of different crops. This could lead to decline in the income levels of the farmers, and this could hamper our food security in the long run. One of the best example happens to be the recent crisis faced in Sri Lanka. Most of you must have read in the newspapers in the recent days that the large scale adoption of organic farming in Sri Lanka had led to decline in the yield rates of different crops. It had led to decline in the income levels of the farmers, and this in turn had compromised the food security in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka recently faced the food crisis, and this has been attributed to the unplanned transition to the organic farming. So, on similar lines, if you promote zero budget natural farming without any kind of empirical evidences, without ascertaining as to whether the yield rates are going to increase or decrease, then in the long run, this could hamper our interest. So this is what has been pointed out by a number of experts. So based upon this particular understanding, the things that would become important from the perspective of your prelims are certain important aspects about the zero budget natural farming. And as far as the mains examination is concerned, one should be aware about the benefits, challenges and way forward with respect to the zero budget natural farming. Accordingly, the two mains questions for practice here are: what do you mean by the zero budget natural farming? Discuss its relevance for doubling the farmer's income. The second practice question here is: there is a need for the scientific validation of the long-term impact and viability of the zero budget natural farming before it can be scaled up at the national level. Discuss. And these are the two practice questions which you should be in a position to attempt once we are done with the discussion. So keeping in mind the requirement of the UPSC examination, we will be discussing on various aspects of zero budget natural farming such as the basic details, the pillars, benefits, challenges and way forward. So what exactly is the zero budget natural farming? The zero budget natural farming is a set of agricultural practices and a grassroots peasant movement that was started by well-known Indian agriculturalist known as Mr. Subhash Palekar. Initially, it evolved in the state of Karnataka as a result of collaboration between Mr. Subhash Palekar and Karnataka Rajya Raita Sangh, which is a collaboration of different farmers in the state of Karnataka. From Karnataka, it has spread to the other southern states such as Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, etc. In particular, it has been hugely successful in the state of Andhra Pradesh. So, what exactly is the philosophy behind the zero budget natural farming? Let's understand that part. See, as I said, the basic objective of the zero budget natural farming is to reduce the input cost of the Indian agriculture and to promote environmentally sustainable practices. In order to fulfill these two objectives, the philosophy of the zero budget natural farming is based upon the philosophy of zero budget and the philosophy of natural farming. See, when you look at this philosophy of zero budget, this particular philosophy is based upon the concept that whatever money which the farmer has to spend on agriculture, this particular money he can earn on his own rather than being dependent upon the credit. So, as you know, a large number of farmers in case of India, they take credit from the money lenders, and usually the money lenders give them loans at a high rate of interest. So this leads to debt trap as well as increase in the farmers' suicides. So in order to solve this particular problem, the zero budget natural farming believes that whatever money which has to be spent on agriculture, that particular money the farmers can earn on their own rather than being dependent upon the credit. So zero budget natural farming does not mean that the farmers don't have to spend any money at all. It basically means that whatever money which they would have to spend, that money they can earn on their own without depending upon the credit. So this is the philosophy of zero budget. As to how we can practice zero budget, first and foremost, we can reduce the external inputs such as fertilizers, pesticides, etc. So whatever external inputs that we use in the agriculture, they can be substituted by the farm level inputs, that is the inputs which are available at the farm level itself. So we can use the farm inputs such as cow dung, urine, etc. in place of the chemical fertilizers, chemical pesticides and so on. Similarly, we can use the crop residue. And nextly, the zero budget natural farming also focuses upon intercropping. Intercropping, as you know, it is growing of multiple crops at the same time on the agricultural fields. So when multiple crops are grown at the same time on the agricultural field, first and foremost, it will reduce the risk of agriculture. And secondly, farmer will be able to earn additional income. And that additional income, he can in turn use it to grow more of crops. So here, when we say zero budget here basically means that the money which is required to be spent on agriculture, that money the farmer is able to earn on his own rather than being dependent upon the credit. Coming to the second philosophy of natural farming. Now this philosophy is based upon a premise that right now the soils have all the necessary nutrients in order to support the growth of various agricultural crops. So as you know, we are using chemical fertilizers such as NPK to support the growth of various crops. But the zero budget natural farming is against the usage of the chemical fertilizers. This is based upon a philosophy that these nutrients are already available in the soil, and since they are already available in the soil, there is no need for external application of these nutrients. But here, the zero budget natural farming believes that even though these nutrients are already available in the soil, these nutrients cannot be absorbed by different crops. So, in order to make these nutrients available to the crops, the zero budget natural farming focuses upon the use of microorganisms such as the earthworms. So these microorganisms such as earthworms will ensure that whatever nutrients are already available in the soil, these nutrients get absorbed by different crops. Apart from that, the zero budget natural farming is against the concept of over irrigation. It is based upon a philosophy that the crops as such do not need more of water. Rather than water, they need more of water vapor. So it is against the usage of the over irrigation. In fact, Mr. Subhash Palekar, he believes that irrigation should be done only during the noon time when the soil moisture is lower. During the other times of the day, we should not focus upon the irrigation of the agricultural field. So, based upon these premises, the natural farming focuses upon the usage of cow dung, cow urine in order to catalyze the microbial activity. So, natural farming believes that when we use cow dung, cow urine, etc., it will be able to catalyze the microbial activity in the soil, and by doing that, we will be able to make available the nutrients for the growth of different crops. Further, it also uses various natural techniques such as less tillage, mulching, that is covering the agricultural land with crop residue, and so on. So, if you look at the natural farming, basically natural farming is practicing agriculture in harmony with the nature, with least amount of interference with the natural practices. So, based upon this aspect of philosophy and basic premise, if you look at the basic pillars of zero budget natural farming, it is based upon the pillars such as Jivamruta. Jivamruta focuses upon using the fermented microbial culture, which has been prepared using the cow dung and cow urine in order to catalyze the microbial activity. It focuses upon the Bijamruta, that is to protect the young roots from various diseases. Then the next one is Achadana or mulching, which focuses upon various techniques such as less tilling, mulching, and so on. The next pillar is Vapasa, that is moisture, which focuses upon the reduced irrigation. So, as I said here, under the zero budget natural farming, there is no need to over irrigate the agricultural land. Irrigation, if at all it is needed, it should be done only during the noon time. The other pillars are the intercropping, rainwater harvesting, using the local species of earthworms, local species of cow, and so on. So, in order to promote the zero budget natural farming, the government has taken a number of initiatives. For example, right now we are implementing two schemes. One is Rashtriya Krishi Vikas Yojana, and the second one is the Paramparagat Krishi Vikas Yojana. The Paramparagat Krishi Vikas Yojana is an initiative of the government to promote organic farming in case of India. And under the Rashtriya Krishi Vikas Yojana, the central government provides the financial support to the state government for the development of the agricultural sector. Both these two schemes are the centrally sponsored schemes. Accordingly, under these two schemes, the central government has allowed the state government to use certain funds for the promotion of the zero budget natural farming. Apart from that, states such as Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Himachal Pradesh, etc., have taken a number of initiatives to promote the zero budget natural farming. In particular, the state of Andhra Pradesh has come up with the ambitious plans as well as initiatives to promote zero budget natural farming on a large scale. So, what exactly are the benefits of the zero budget natural farming? See, as I discussed before, the green revolution has led to the highly input intensive agriculture, and it has also led to the environmentally unsustainable practices. Both of these two reasons have in turn led to a stagnation in the income levels of the farmers. So, to a certain extent, the zero budget natural farming has a potential to reduce the input cost of the agriculture, to make the Indian agriculture more environmentally sustainable, and thus it has a potential to increase the income levels of the farmers. Now, this becomes quite important because if you look at the Committee on Doubling of Farmers' Income, which was headed by Mr. Ashok Dalwai, according to this particular committee, there are basically three constraints for doubling the farmers' income. One, higher input cost. That's the first constraint. Second constraint is lower productivity of agriculture. And the third constraint is with respect to lower prices received by the farmers. So, zero budget natural farming will help us address the first constraints for doubling the farmers' income, that is the higher input cost. So, undoubtedly, the zero budget natural farming has a potential to double the farmers' income. So accordingly, the various benefits are, first and foremost, as I said, it will help us address the input cost and address the present agrarian distress, particularly in the green revolution states. Secondly, it will help us reduce the dependence of the farmers on the credit which they otherwise take from the money lenders, which may lead to a debt trap and also increase in farmer suicides. Thirdly, undoubtedly the zero budget natural farming can increase the soil fertility. Nextly, presently the Indian agriculture utilizes almost 80 to 85% of the water. Now, since India is staring at the problem of climate change, we need to come up with climate resilient agricultural practices, and one way of doing it is through the zero budget natural farming. The zero budget natural farming has a potential to reduce the water consumption by almost around 50 to 60%. Nextly, as you know, the Indian agriculture has come to be dominated by rice and wheat cropping system. This in turn has led to a number of problems. As the zero budget natural farming focuses upon the intercropping, we would be able to promote the diversification of Indian agriculture. So by techniques such as intercropping, we would be able to increase the production of pulses, oil seeds, fruits, vegetables, etc. This will reduce the risk of agriculture and enhance the income levels of the farmers. So these are some of the benefits which are associated with the zero budget natural farming. In spite of these benefits, some of the agricultural experts have raised a number of concerns and challenges with respect to the zero budget natural farming. Let's understand these concerns and challenges. See, first biggest concern here is the green revolution was highly input intensive and required more of inputs. This to a certain extent has been addressed through the zero budget natural farming, which is less input intensive. But at the same time, the zero budget natural farming is more knowledge intensive. It means that the farmers need to have adequate amount of training. They need to have adequate amount of knowledge with respect to various agricultural practices of the zero budget natural farming. So unless the farmers are well trained, unless they have a necessary knowledge about the zero budget natural farming, we would find it difficult to increase the penetration of zero budget natural farming in the Indian economy. That's the first constraint. The next set of concerns and challenges have been raised by the group of agricultural experts at the National Academy of Agricultural Sciences. So let's understand as to what concerns they have raised. See, in the past, in order to increase the production of different agricultural commodities, we adopted basically two strategies. One, we adopted modern scientific practices such as adoption of high yielding variety of seeds, chemical fertilizers, chemical pesticides, and so on. And before adopting these modern scientific practices, we focus upon the empirical evidences. That is, we carried out field level studies. We first ascertained that whether these modern scientific practices will lead to increase in production of different agricultural commodities or not. Only when we got positive results, we went for adoption of these modern scientific practices, which in turn has led to increase in production. So this is what has happened in the past. But if you look at the zero budget natural farming, the zero budget natural farming challenges the very foundation of the modern scientific practices. This is so because the zero budget natural farming is against the modern scientific practices such as the adoption of high yielding variety of seeds, against chemical fertilizers, against pesticides, etc. So instead of modern scientific practices, the zero budget natural farming focuses on adoption of the traditional agricultural practices. See, to be fair to zero budget natural farming, the biggest benefit of these traditional practices is that it will help us promote environmentally sustainable practices. So this will help us reduce the input cost, it will help us increase the soil fertility, reduce the water consumption, and so on. All of these are the benefits. But the question here is, can these traditional agricultural practices lead to increase in production? Can it lead to increase in the yield rates of different crops? That is a question which has to be asked. So previously in the past, when we adopted these modern scientific practices, we adopted these practices only after carrying out field level studies, only after we ascertained or got to know that these modern scientific practices will lead to increase in production, increase in the yield rates. But as far as the zero budget natural farming, right now we do not have any kind of empirical evidences or the field level studies which are carried out across India. So the agricultural experts at the National Academy of Agricultural Sciences have pointed out that India should go for large scale adoption of zero budget natural farming only when we have empirical evidences in support of these traditional practices. The agricultural experts have cautioned the government that the large scale adoption of the zero budget natural farming without any kind of empirical evidences can actually lead to decrease in the food production by 50%, and this can affect the food security as well as income security of the farmers. Thirdly, these agricultural experts have also pointed out that the zero budget natural farming is based upon certain unscientific premise. For example, the zero budget natural farming is against the usage of the high yielding seed varieties. Secondly, the zero budget natural farming assumes that the soils have all the necessary ingredients, which may not be the case. And thirdly, the zero budget natural farming also believes that the cow dung and cow urine can provide all the necessary nutrients to the different crops. So because of this aspects, the agricultural experts have pointed out that the zero budget natural farming is based upon certain unscientific premise. Nextly, see in case of India, the agroecology is different. Different places have different environment, different places have different soil conditions. The availability of water across India is not uniform. So accordingly, zero budget natural farming is a kind of traditional practice which cannot be practiced across India. For example, in some of the regions of India, the soils are highly acidic or they are saline, because of which there is less potential to adopt the zero budget natural farming in those areas. So zero budget natural farming can be practiced only in certain specific parts of India. It cannot be replicated at all India level throughout all the agroecologies. And lastly, as I highlighted, the adoption of the zero budget natural farming should be based upon the empirical evidences. For example, I have already highlighted the recent experience of Sri Lanka, where Sri Lanka, when it adopted large scale organic farming, it led to the food crisis. Apart from that, even in case of India as well, some of the sources have pointed out that Sikkim, which was the first organic state in India, now in case of Sikkim, some of the farmers are now switching back to the conventional farming because the yield or the money which they are able to get from the organic farming, this has been quite lower in comparison to the conventional farming. So based upon these empirical evidences, we must ensure that the zero budget natural farming leads to increase in the yields, in the production, as well as increase in the income levels of the farmers in the long run. So to sum up our discussion, the adoption of zero budget natural farming is undoubtedly a step in the right direction. The zero budget natural farming has a potential to reduce the input cost, promote environmentally sustainable practices. But its adoption has to be in turn supported by field level independent studies. So when field level independent studies indicate that the adoption of these agricultural practices can increase the production, they can increase the yield rates, only then we should promote zero budget natural farming at a large scale throughout India. Apart from that, we must also understand that India is a country which is known for its diversity, even in terms of agriculture also. So just one set of practice cannot be replicated throughout India. Different regions can adopt different models depending upon their own agroecology. In certain parts of India where the soil fertility has drastically reduced, where the soils are highly acidic or saline, in those areas we would have to go for the adoption of chemical fertilizers, chemical pesticides, etc. In those areas where the quality of soil is quite good, where we feel that the potential of the zero budget natural farming can be optimally utilized, in those areas we must go for the zero budget natural farming. Now coming to the main question for practice and its model answer. The question here is, there is a need for the scientific validation of the long-term impact and viability of the zero budget natural farming before it can be scaled up at the national level. Discuss. So this particular question basically requires you to discuss various constraints and challenges with respect to adoption of the zero budget natural farming. In particular, you should have to focus upon the long-term impact and viability of the zero budget natural farming. So as far as the introduction to this particular answer is concerned, in the introduction you can highlight as to what is zero budget natural farming and what are its benefits. And as far as the body of the answer is concerned, in the body of the answer, you should discuss various concerns and challenges of the zero budget natural farming as highlighted by the group of agricultural experts at the National Academy of Agricultural Sciences. So you can highlight various concerns and challenges, and then as a way forward, you can write in conclusion that the large scale adoption of the zero budget natural farming should be based upon the evidence based approach and based upon certain scientific evidences. And as far as these two prelims questions for practice is concerned, please try to find out the answers on your own and let me know the answer in the comment section given below. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 1 of the text and context page of the Hindu newspaper. The article is titled as The Growth of India's Defense Exports. Now, this particular article discusses about the increase in India's export of defense goods. Accordingly, this particular article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3, both from the perspective of Indian economy as well as internal security. So since this particular article talks about the increase in export of defense goods from India, first and foremost, you should know about present status of India's trade in defense goods. And secondly, you should also know about various initiatives taken by the government to boost the defense manufacturing. In particular, you should know about the defense acquisition procedure, which was recently in news. So keeping in mind these aspects, let us look into the present status and initiatives with respect to defense manufacturing. See, when you look at the present status of defense production, in the year 2019-20, the defense production was worth around rupees 80,000 crores, out of which the public sector entities accounted for a major chunk. They accounted for 80% of the production of defense goods. The remaining 20% was contributed by the private entities. According to an international think tank known as the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, India was the second largest importer of defense goods after Saudi Arabia in the year 2019-20. Almost around 65 to 75% of defense goods are imported into India. As far as the exports from India is concerned, the overall export of defense goods has increased from rupees 1,500 crores in the year 2016-17 to rupees 8,500 crores in the year 2020-21. Companies such as Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, Ordnance Factory Board, and Bharat Electronics Limited are considered to be among the top 100 defense companies across the world. In order to reduce the import of defense goods and to boost the indigenization of defense manufacturing, the Government of India has come out with the Defense Production and Export Promotion Policy 2020. Under this particular policy, the government has set ambitious target to increase the production of the defense goods. The target here is to have a turnover of $25 billion with exports worth rupees $500 billion by the end of 2025. Hence, in order to reduce the import of goods and to boost the domestic manufacturing, the Government of India has taken a number of initiatives. First and foremost, see, prior to the year 2001, the private sector entities were not allowed in the defense manufacturing. But in the year 2001, we have de-reserved the defense manufacturing, which means that now we are enabling the private sector participation even in the defense production, because of which the share of the private sector in the defense production has now increased to around 20%. Secondly, India has also adopted liberalized FDI regime, wherein now the government allows the FDI up to 74% through the automatic route and up to 100% through the approval route. See, earlier the government used to allow FDI up to 49% through the automatic route, but as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package in the year 2020, the government has increased the FDI limit through the automatic route to 74%. Second is, the government has come up with a defense offset policy, which has been introduced through the defense acquisition procedure. This defense offset policy has been introduced based upon the recommendations of the Vijay Kelkar committee. So let's understand as to how this defense offset policy would help us increase the production of defense goods. So this particular defense offset policy comes into being whenever the Indian government is purchasing the defense goods from a foreign company. So whenever the Indian government is purchasing the defense goods from the foreign company would be required to fulfill the offset obligation. Offset obligation basically means that whatever money the Indian government is paying to this particular foreign company for purchase of a particular defense goods, the foreign company would be required to invest certain percentage of the defense deal in India. Now, for example, let's say the Indian government is purchasing a fighter jet from a US based company whose value is equal to rupees 1000 crores. So, under this offset policy, the foreign company here will be required to fulfill an offset obligation of 30% of this defense deal. In this case, this foreign company will be required to make an investment of rupees 300 crores in the Indian economy as part of this offset obligation. Now, question is, in what way this investment can be made in the Indian economy? Now, this investment can be made in the Indian economy through the transfer of technology, through the transfer of equipment to the Indian companies, or through purchase of equipment for the Indian companies, or by entering into joint ventures with the Indian company. So there are a number of ways and means through which a foreign company can fulfill this particular offset obligation. See, recently the government has changed the requirement of this offset obligation. Earlier, this offset obligation used to come into picture only when the government used to purchase the defense goods of more than rupees 300 crores. Only then the offset obligation used to come into picture. But now the government has increased the requirement of when the offset obligation would come into picture. Now the offset obligation would come into picture only when the Indian government is purchasing defense goods of more than 2000 crores. So earlier, a foreign company was required to make an investment in India whenever the defense deal was worth more than rupees 300 crores. But now the foreign company would be required to fulfill the offset obligation only when the defense deal is more than 2000 crores. So if the defense deal is less than 2000 crores, then the foreign company will no longer be required to fulfill the offset obligation. As far as the percentage of offset obligation is concerned, that has remained the same even today at 30%. So please do make a note of important changes which have been introduced in the defense offset policy. The next important policy is with respect to the Defense Procurement Procedure 2020. See, normally the Indian government purchases the defense goods both from the domestic companies as well as the foreign companies. And ideally, when the Indian government wants to purchase the defense goods, it should give more amount of priority to the domestic companies over and above the foreign companies. Even within the domestic companies itself, the Indian government should have to give more amount of priority to the defense goods which are indigenously designed and indigenously manufactured in India. To those goods, we must give more amount of priority when we are procuring the defense goods. So when the government is giving more amount of priority to the defense goods which are indigenously designed, which are indigenously manufactured in India, we would be able to promote Atmanirbhar Bharat in the defense manufacturing. Accordingly, the Defense Procurement Procedure 2020 gives highest priority to the defense goods which are indigenously designed, developed and manufactured in India. So let's say the government wants to buy the fighter aircrafts, and the government, let's say, has two options of either procuring it from a domestic company or a foreign company. And let's say both these two companies are able to meet the specifications laid down by the government. And if this domestic company has indigenously designed, manufactured the fighter aircraft, then the Indian government would give higher priority to this domestic company over the foreign company with respect to procurement. The other important policy initiatives are the government has put a ban on import of almost around 100 defense goods which the government believes can be manufactured within India. The government has also decided to set up two defense corridors in the state of UP as well as Tamil Nadu. So based upon this particular article's discussion, please try to attempt these two practice questions for the prelims. Let me know the answer in the comment section given below. With this, Let us take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 12. The article is titled as 13 billion plan to boost the RuPay card use. Now, this particular article talks about a newly launched scheme in order to boost the RuPay payments and the UPI payments in the Indian economy. Now, this particular article shall be important mainly with respect to prelims under the subsection of government schemes and policies. Apart from that, this particular article is also important because in prelims 2018, a rated question on merchant discount rate has already been asked. So as part of the analysis of this particular article, we'll first understand as to what exactly is the merchant discount rate, and then we'll discuss about the newly launched scheme of the government of India. See, the merchant discount rate, it is basically a fee which is paid by the merchants on acceptance of the payments through the debit card, credit card, or the QR code. So let's understand as to how does this merchant discount rate actually work. Now let's say you as a person, you have an account with the ICICI Bank, and let's say you are making a payment to a merchant, and for making this payment you may be using the ICICI debit card, credit card, or you may be making the payment to the QR code. Now the merchant here who is accepting the payment, this particular merchant would be required to pay the merchant discount rate to his own bank. Now let's say he has an account with the HDFC Bank. So this merchant here will be required to pay the merchant discount rate to his bank, that is the HDFC Bank. So this merchant discount rate, it is defined in terms of the percentage of the transaction value. And this normally ranges from 0.4% to 0.85%. So MDR charges ranges between 0.4 to 0.85. Now for example, let's say you are making a payment worth rupees 100, and let's say in this case the MDR charges is being mentioned at 0.4%. So here 0.4 rupees would be paid by the merchant to his bank, that is the HDFC Bank. So this entire MDR initially goes to his own bank, and from there this merchant discount rate is in turn distributed among three different entities. First and foremost, certain part of MDR remains at the merchant bank itself, that is the HDFC Bank. Secondly, certain part of MDR goes to the customer's bank, that is the ICICI Bank, and certain part of MDR goes to the payment system operator such as the card networks. So you must have heard of the card networks such as the MasterCard, Visa, RuPay. It can also go to payment system operators such as the fintech companies. So you must have heard about the Paytm, Google Pay, Phone Pay, etc. So initially this MDR goes to the merchant bank, and from the merchant bank it gets distributed among the different entities. Certain part of MDR remains with the merchant bank, certain part of MDR goes to the customer's bank, and certain part of MDR goes to the concerned payment system operator. Now for example, let's say you are making a payment to a merchant through the Paytm app, and let's say in this case you are using the QR code. So here this merchant will be required to make the payment to the merchant bank, and this merchant bank in turn will distribute the MDR to the customer's bank as well as to the Paytm company in this particular case. So as you can see here, this merchant discount rate, it is distributed between the merchant bank, customer's bank, and the payment system operator. So whatever money these entities get in the form of merchant discount rate, that particular money they can in turn use it in order to improve the digital infrastructure. For example, the HDFC company here can use this money earned in the form of MDR to improve the penetration of the point of sale machines. Now coming to the background to the newly launched scheme. See, on Jan 1st, 2020, the government of India decided to waive off the MDR charges on the payments made through the RuPay and the Bheem UPI, which means that if you as a customer, if you are using the RuPay debit card or if you are using the Bheem UPI to make the payment, in that particular case, the merchants here will no longer be required to pay the MDR charges. Now this MDR charges were waived off only on the transactions made through RuPay or the Bheem UPI. On the other hand, if you are making a payment through the MasterCard, Visa, etc., in that particular case, the merchant will be required to pay the MDR charges, which is normal. But in case of UPI or the Bheem UPI, the merchant will no longer be required to pay the MDR charges. So this was a government decision as on Jan 1st, 2020. The government had done so in order to encourage the adoption of RuPay cards as well as BHIM and to promote the cashless economy. So if the merchants are not required to pay the MDR charges on the payments which they accept through RuPay or the BHIM UPI, in that case, automatically more number of merchants will accept the payments through RuPay as well as BHIM UPI. It will also encourage more of customers to make digital payments. So overall, the government had come up with such a move in order to improve the penetration of digital payments in India. But the government's move to waive off the MDR charges on the RuPay and BHIM UPI had led to certain problems. The first problem was it was leading to a loss to NPCI, which has developed the RuPay and the UPI payments. So as I said earlier, a certain part of MDR goes to the payment system operator, in this case RuPay. And as you know, RuPay has been developed by NPCI, National Payment Corporation of India. So if you waive off the MDR charges, NPCI will not be able to get a part of MDR, so it's a loss. And if it doesn't earn money, NPCI will not be in a position to invest more amount of money for new innovative technologies. Secondly, see if the private banks are using Visa card, MasterCard, etc., then the private banks will be able to get a share of the merchant discount rate. But if they are using the RuPay card, then the banks as such will not be able to get a share of MDR. So the private banks as such, they had started shifting towards Visa as well as MasterCard, basically to earn the merchant discount rate. And thirdly, the waiving off of MDR on the payments made through the UPI was also leading to losses of the fintech companies, that is the payment system operators such as Paytm, Google Pay, PhonePe, etc. And here, if NPCI does not has money to make investment to improve the digital penetration, if the fintech companies are making more amount of losses, obviously this could have an adverse impact on the expansion of the digital payments in the Indian economy. Hence, in order to solve these problems which have arisen because of waiving off of the MDR charges, the government of India has now launched a new scheme. Under this particular scheme, whatever losses the banks are incurring for the zero merchant discount rate on RuPay and BHIM UPI, that loss they will be compensated by the government of India. Now, for example, let's say if a particular bank is earning a MDR of 0.4% on the payments made through Visa, and let's say in this case they are able to get a commission of rupees 100. Now, the same transaction, if it is done through RuPay, in that case, as of now, they are not getting any kind of commission. They are not earning any kind of merchant discount rate. So whatever loss which they are incurring here, that is rupees 100, that loss the government would compensate through the newly launched scheme. Now this particular scheme will be applicable only to the RuPay debit cards, that is the payments made through RuPay debit cards, and the low value BHIM UPI transactions. Low value basically means that the transactions whose value is up to rupees 2000. The total outlay of this particular scheme is rupees 1300 crores, and it is expected that when the government is compensating the banks for the loss of zero MDR, the banks will be able to get money, and that money they can in turn use in order to build the robust infrastructure for the acceptance of digital payments in India. So these are some of the important details which you should know with respect to the newly launched scheme. Now, based upon our understanding, please try to attempt these two questions and let me know the answer in the comment section given below. With this, let us take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 9. The article is titled as Indigenous Efforts to Make Unmanned Aerial Vehicles Crosses a Milestone. This particular article shall be important from the perspective of prelims under the subsection of Science and Technology. Now, this particular article highlights about the recent milestone which has been crossed by the Rustom 2 unmanned aerial vehicle. So let us understand various aspects related to the unmanned aerial vehicles. See, the unmanned aerial vehicles are basically the aerial vehicles with no onboard pilots. So these unmanned aerial vehicles, they are remotely operated or they may be programmed to operate in a certain way. The significance of the unmanned aerial vehicles is that they can be involved in various kinds of operations such as reconnaissance, surveillance, intelligence gathering, as well as target acquisition, because of which they can be used for the surveillance of border, particularly along the Indo-China border, Indo-Pakistan border. They can help us track the movement of terrorists and insurgents, and they can also be used to launch attacks. So those unmanned aerial vehicles which can be used to launch attacks, they are referred to as the combat aerial vehicles. The unmanned aerial vehicles are basically categorized into two types depending upon the altitude at which they can operate. So one, we have the medium altitude long endurance unmanned aerial vehicles which can fly between the altitude of 25,000 feet to 28,000 feet, and we have the high altitude long endurance unmanned aerial vehicles which fly above the altitude of 28,000 feet. So as far as the Rustam 2 unmanned aerial vehicle is concerned, it is basically a medium altitude long endurance unmanned aerial vehicle. The Rustam 2 has been developed by DRDO. It has all the necessary capabilities and it meets the requirement of Army, Navy as well as Air Force. Recently, the Rustam 2 has reached a new milestone by reaching an altitude of 25,000 feet, and it has an endurance of almost around 10 hours. So as I said, the medium altitude long endurance unmanned aerial vehicles can operate between the altitude of 25,000 feet to 28,000 feet. So Rustam 2 has achieved this new milestone. So going forward, the DRDO is set to focus more upon the development of the high altitude long endurance unmanned aerial vehicles in future. Presently, the Indian Defence Forces are using a number of unmanned aerial vehicles. Some of these include Heron, which has been bought by India from Israel, and then we have certain indigenously developed unmanned aerial vehicles, some of which include Lakshya, Nishant, Daksh, as well as Netra. Apart from that, India is also developing its first stealth unmanned combat aerial vehicle known as Ghatak. So these are some important aspects which one should know with respect to the unmanned aerial vehicles from the perspective of the prelims examination. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Now let us have a look at the question for the day. The answer to the question that was asked in yesterday's DNS is option A.